Okay, so it's been quite an 8 weeks we've had. We've covered a lot of ground. Okay, so from microeconomics, we got into price theory, we got into elasticity, we got into estimating demand curves. We saw actually how to do this using correlations, using simple linear regression models with price and quantity datas, and I've also shown you that the actual topic itself is causal. It's a cause effect. And when you talk about elasticity, you talk about what's the effect on quantity for a price change, right? So the thing is there's a lot of other things that cause cause quantities to change. We have seasonality, all kinds of different types of events. And so these are naturally, or best, most, I guess, done within the setting of experimental types of methods. And I've shown you different types of those at a very high level with treatments, control groups. I've showed you some of my research that does away with all that and does some machine learning stuff. So I kind of gave you the spread of the gambit there, just so you could at least have the contextualized framework for where all of that is sitting. So we covered a lot there. Within the context of what you've done technically, we're looking at using elasticity and understanding how elasticity is going to impact your understanding of, well, if I change prices, what happens to my revenues, right? Elasticity is the metric that will tell you how your revenues are impacted by price changes. And so we got into that quite a bit. Now, after we jumped from microeconomics, went to macroeconomics, we studied a lot of different topics, but primarily around the concept of asset bubbles. And we've got a great IMF paper by Sherbina, and so you've got all these different ideas about what a bubble is. Departure from a market value or market price that departs from a fundamental valuation. And there's a lot of different ideas as to how these bubbles actually occur. And so Sherbina, there's a lot of different theories there you could look at it and think about. So within all of those different sort of theoretical context, we also have a book that you've been reading, this Mania, Panics, and Crashes. This book was very much, I think it's a great go-to reader. I know that we didn't dive into the specifics of the text per se, but this text actually did support a lot of what we were talking about in these parts of the sections. And I hope it's something that you'll continue to read because, guess what? There's going to be more bubbles and there's going to be more chances. Actually, a bubble is a chance to make money. You can make money on all different kinds of sides of the bubble. So just knowing how to play the bubble sometimes is maybe the best thing that you can get out of this part of the class. And understanding specifically how credit and how liquidity and credits and access to credit and just the flow of everything, how that all works within the context of that book. I think that book does an extraordinary job there. With that, we also looked at macroeconomic analysis. So under macroeconomic analysis, we looked at time series data, and what we found in the time series is actually that, what did we find? We found that you could get spurious correlations. So, we can have when we look at things in levels, so you look at, say, like GDP and the 10-year interest rate in levels, you see a clearly negative correlation. Well, when we look at the level of the interest rates, we saw those were falling. There's a negative trend. We see GDP grows. There's a growing trend. So the trends are moving in opposite directions, and that's what is actually driving this clearly negative correlation. Now, when I take the trend out, and that's what you should have gotten, technically wise, for time series data, is take the trend out. Okay, if there's one, take it out. And I gave you a transformation. That's the log. So you take log, the natural log, and then you take first differences. And that's just basically subtracting the current value from the previous in logs. And so that log first differences gives you a growth rate. That calculates a growth rate. And the growth rate, you see, doesn't have a trend. And then when we scatter, we can actually look at how is the change in one correlated with the change of another. And that actually kind of gets more to heart of the true correlation. Now, there's some things that I have to say were kind of surprising to me that I didn't see correlations that I expected. And another thing, little side note, is whenever you're doing these type of graphs, you should always guess how you think it's going to look before you actually look at it. And then in this case, I actually thought, well, look, when GDP is lower, I thought, well, they're going to probably be cutting interest rates as try to stimulate the economy, right? They're trying to stimulate the economy when it's lower. So that's what I thought was going to happen. But when I looked at growth rate, so I expected actually this negative trend in levels to sort of continue and parlay up to a negative trend in growth rates, but it didn't happen. You see right here, it shows us a slight positive trend. It's actually statistically not significantly different from zero, but you see it's clearly not negative. It doesn't look negative. There's nothing negative scattered about that. That's kind of surprising to me. So when I stopped and I thought, okay, well, that's not what I expected. So I know, I mean, like if you just watch and you're connected about anything, you understand that the Federal Reserve typically has had this policy of trying to cut interest rates to try to spur the economy. That is part of how they actually do their policy making. So why is there not this negative correlation? And I just had to look at it. What's going on here? So this is how you kind of question the data. And so one thing I just did really quickly is I just pulled up there's different types of interest rates too, by the way. So we were looking at the 10-year, and this is actually a different rate. This is the federal funds rate. This is a rate that the bank sets, the Federal Reserve Bank. And you see it follows a similar trend as the 10-year, except you see that it actually builds up and gets higher prior to the 2008, and then right before 2008, this is in July, this is still 2007, it's still sliding. This is well before the collapse of Lehman Brothers. The Federal Reserve was cutting interest rates. That's amazing right there. Look, they were cutting interest rates over here too, before we had the recession. And again, they're cutting it before they had the recession. We see cuts before the recession. We see cuts before the recession going all the way back. Well, yeah, it's almost all the way back, but throughout from 1980 to current, we've seen that they're cutting this federal funds rate before the recession. That right there may be why we don't see the correlation. Basically, what I'm saying is that they could be cutting the rates, but you see now that they've cut the rates pretty good, the recession is kicking in, and I guess there's also these times when, it's just actually we see that the policy response, it starts to come maybe a little bit before the actual recession. That could be part of the reason. I'm still very curious as to why I didn't see a stronger negative correlation there. But because we can clearly see from this graph that the Federal Reserve cuts rates before the recession and then dropped it pretty substantially during the recession. So there's something going on here. What we could actually try to look at this if we had a more advanced model, which we don't do. We can't do this in a scatter plot, but in our regression, we can add in lags. So look at lags of basically the correlation of GDP and these interest rates in the current period. That's contemporaneous correlation, and then the correlation between, say, GDP in the current period and the last period's interest rate changes, or the period before. You can kind of look back and back like that to try to find out if there's any rhyme or reason, or we could think of other measures to try to think of creating. Or maybe what we need to do is, instead of looking at this, this is actually daily. So maybe the daily, because there's all these positive and negative changes, that's another thing too. Maybe the daily correlation was it's just too frequent. There's too much frequency, and that all that noise is tossing us off. So what I'm saying here is maybe the graph that we had here is just because it's too noisy. Maybe if we just need to look at the yearly average, something like that. That might be another way to look at it. Just a simple way, correlation wise. Yeah, see, so these are all the different ways we can think about trying to approach these problems. And we need to explore, right? We should explore these things. If we still don't find anything, we can look and try to think and try to make some type of corrections to try to see if we can't find what we think is there. At some point, maybe we need to convince ourselves of what's actually going on with this data. And that's the whole question. Is I want to be really, really careful. I'm not trying to impose my ideas onto this data set. You might appear that way a little bit, but I want to be careful. I'm not opposing. What I'm doing is I'm trying to kind of question, so why am I not seeing this? And so very specifically, I can try to make certain types of corrections. Um, so like I said, I saw that there was a frequency. Well, let's try to correct that by looking at a yearly. Okay. That would take all that frequent, very high fluctuations of daily data out. Maybe. Interesting. So those are the ways to play with it. Anyway, I've given you a lot of different random sort of tidbits about how to work with data, how to interpret data, how to tell stories with data. You've gotten certified in Tableau and learning how to put storyboards that then can be exported into PowerPoint presentations. There's actually quite a lot more you can do within Tableau, and I just encourage you to keep going with that. You also have gotten access to LinkedIn Learning, and with that, you can always just keep going and getting more certifications, get more skills. And if you have any questions along the way in the future, please feel free to just reach out to me. Use me as a resource. Always am a resource for you. So very happy to stay in touch, as you go forward and, into your careers. Please feel free to keep me in mind and let me know if I can ever help you in any way.